The history of the United States of America is a sprawling narrative beginning long before its founding on July 4, 1776, a tale of relentless expansion, profound ideological conflict, and remarkable human accomplishment that has earned the country the name the modern Roman Empire. The continent was first inhabited by native peoples who had developed complex and sophisticated societies over thousands of years. However, the course of history was altered in 1492 when Christopher Columbus, an explorer employed by Spain, inadvertently discovered the West Indies while searching for a faster route to India. This new frontier, quickly termed the New World, initiated a race for colonization among the major European powers of the age: Spanish, English, Portuguese, Swedish, Dutch, and French, all of whom sought to claim and map the enormous landmass. Early interactions with native tribes, though sometimes welcoming, were tragically disastrous for the indigenous populations who were exposed to European diseases, causing widespread illness and death. The English struggled with several initial attempts at permanent settlements, most notably the lost colony of Roanoke, but ultimately achieved success with the establishment of Jamestown, Virginia in 1607, which, 12 years later, became the site of a tragic first when the first African slaves arrived, marking the beginning of 2.5 centuries of brutal chattel slavery. This was followed by the 1620 settlement of Plymouth, Massachusetts, by Puritan pilgrims seeking religious freedom who drafted the Mayflower Compact and, with the aid of the local Wampanoag tribe, celebrated what is known as the First Thanksgiving. As the colonies grew, control over the continent was fiercely contested, marked by brutal conflicts such as King Philip's War against the Wampanoag and a series of 4 major conflicts pitting the English against the French and their respective native allies, which eventually culminated in the global French and Indian War, 1754 to 1763. The subsequent British victory and immense territorial gains, including all of Canada, secured their holdings, but created staggering war debts that the British Parliament sought to recoup by levying new acts and taxes on the American colonists. The colonists viewed these acts, such as the Sugar Act 1764 and the unprecedented direct tax of the Stamp Act 1765, as violations of their rights as British subjects, rallying around the cry of no taxation without representation. Resentment fermented, leading to the formation of secret organizations like the Sons of Liberty, who incited violence against British officials and led coordinated boycotts of British goods. Tensions escalated dramatically with the 1770 Boston Massacre, where British troops fired into a crowd of colonists, killing 5, and exploded fully in 1773 with the Boston Tea Party, where Sons of Liberty activists dumped 342 crates of tea into the harbor. Parliament responded with the Punitive and Tolerable Acts, but these only served to unify the colonies, leading to the formation of the First and Second Continental Congresses. The conflict turned to war on April 19, 1775, when militiamen faced British regulars at Lexington, where a shot rang out, the shot heard around the world, and the American Revolution began. George Washington, a veteran of the French and Indian War, was unanimously chosen to lead the new Continental Army, an untrained and often undisciplined force of soldiers from nearly every colony. After nearly a year of fighting for the reconciliation of rights as British subjects, the Congress finally shifted its goal, adopting the Declaration of Independence on July 4, 1776, which asserted the self-evident truth that all men are created equal and were endowed with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This act transformed the war into a full-fledged revolution and secured the assistance of France after the crucial American victory at the Battle of Saratoga in 1777. Despite a devastating retreat from New York and a brutal winter at Valley Forge, Washington kept the army intact, winning morale-boosting victories at Trenton and Princeton, and eventually trapping the main British forces at Yorktown, Virginia in 1781, forcing a surrender that marked the end of major military action. The subsequent Treaty of Paris in 1783 officially recognized the United States as a sovereign nation. Following the Revolution, the initial government established by the Articles of Confederation proved too weak, unable to manage interstate disputes or enforce treaties, a failure dramatically exposed by Shays' Rebellion in 1786. In response, the Constitutional Convention convened in 1787 and drafted an entirely new system of governance, the U.S. Constitution, which formed a government of checks and balances with three distinct branches: the legislative, Congress; the executive, President; and the judicial, Supreme Court. The Constitution was ratified after intense debate, championed by figures like Alexander Hamilton and James Madison in the Federalist Papers, and George Washington was unanimously elected as the nation's first president. Washington's tenure set numerous critical precedents, including the establishment of a national bank, the personal command of troops to quell the Whiskey Rebellion, and the monumental decision to step down after 2 terms, ensuring the office would not resemble a monarchy. The early republic continued to expand its borders, securing the vast Louisiana Purchase from France in 1803 and successfully navigating the War of 1812, a conflict with Great Britain that saw the burning of the U.S. Capitol but ultimately solidified American sovereignty on the world stage. This era was defined by the concept of manifest destiny, the belief that the U.S. was destined to control the entire continent, leading to the tragic Indian Removal Act of 1830 under President Andrew Jackson, which resulted in the forced displacement of over 60,000 Native Americans along the deadly Trail of Tears. American expansion continued, marked by the Texas Revolution 1835 to 1836, the subsequent annexation of Texas, and the swift Mexican-American War 1846 to 1848, which resulted in the U.S. acquiring immense territory, including present-day California, New Mexico, and Arizona. The question of whether slavery would be allowed to expand into these new territories brought the nation to a breaking point, despite years of compromise efforts such as the Missouri Compromise and the Fugitive Slave Act. Escalating tensions led to civil war in Kansas, known as Bleeding Kansas, and radical actions like abolitionist John Brown's 1859 raid on Harper's Ferry. The election of Republican Abraham Lincoln in 1860, who campaigned on a platform opposing the expansion of slavery, was the final straw, triggering the secession of Southern states. The Civil War officially began with the Confederate bombardment of Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, launching a bloody 4-year conflict where the tactical brilliance of Confederate General Robert E. Lee in the East was countered by the relentless strategy of Union General Ulysses S. Grant in the West. Key turning points included the Union victories at Gettysburg and Grant's capture of Vicksburg in July 1863, which marked the high tide of the Confederacy. In 1862, Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, fundamentally shifting the war's goal from mere reunification to the permanent abolition of slavery, which was secured with the passage of the 13th Amendment in January 1865. The war finally concluded with Lee's surrender to Grant at Appomattox Courthouse, but the optimism was shattered by Lincoln's assassination just days later. The subsequent era of Reconstruction, 1865 to 1877, saw the passage of the 14th and 15th Amendments, which granted citizenship and voting rights to Black Americans, but efforts to enforce these rights were met with systemic violence, oppression, and the rise of white supremacist groups like the Ku Klux Klan, ultimately leading to the abandonment of federal protection under the Jim Crow era. This period also ushered in the Gilded Age, 1870s to 1900, a time of enormous economic growth, massive immigration from Europe, and the completion of the Transcontinental Railroad, all while a few powerful moguls, the robber barons like Rockefeller and Carnegie, amassed unprecedented wealth, fueling widespread poverty, stark inequality, and violent labor strikes. These issues prompted the Progressive Era, 1900 to 1920, marked by social reform movements, the work of muckraker journalists, and trust-busting efforts by President Theodore Roosevelt. This period saw significant constitutional changes, including the 16th Amendment, income tax, the 17th Amendment, direct election of senators, prohibition with the 18th Amendment, and women's suffrage with the 19th Amendment in 1920. The U.S. simultaneously extended its influence abroad, annexing Hawaii and emerging as a world power after a swift victory in the Spanish-American War of 1898, acquiring territories like Puerto Rico and Guam. The U.S. was drawn into World War I, 1914 to 1918, after initially remaining neutral, ultimately contributing to the Allied victory, but immediately returned to isolationism by rejecting the Treaty of Versailles. This was followed by the Roaring Twenties, a time of consumer boom, the rise of jazz music, and an attempt to enforce prohibition that instead fueled organized crime. The decade ended abruptly and disastrously with the 1929 stock market crash, ushering in the decade-long Great Depression and ecological disaster of the Dust Bowl. Democratic President Franklin D. Roosevelt, FDR, responded with the New Deal, a series of massive programs creating jobs through the Works Progress Administration, WPA, and enacting landmark legislation like Social Security. The nation was then plunged into World War II, 1939 to 1945, following the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941, a conflict that saw the horrific internment of over 120,000 Japanese Americans, major operations like D-Day, and the ultimate decision by President Harry Truman to use the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki to force Japan's surrender. The U.S. emerged as a superpower, but immediately entered the decades-long Cold War with the Soviet Union, driven by the policy of containment and the terrifying arms race. This global ideological conflict was marked by the domestic Red Scare, the erection of the Berlin Wall, the space race culminating in the Apollo 11 moon landing, and proxy conflicts like the Korean War and the bloody, unsuccessful Vietnam War, which bitterly divided the country. Concurrently, the civil rights movement fought against segregation and disenfranchisement under Jim Crow, achieving monumental victories through nonviolent protests, including the Montgomery bus boycott, the March on Washington, and landmark legislation like the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965. The late 20th century saw the Watergate scandal that brought down President Nixon, the conservative economic shift under Ronald Reagan, Reaganomics, the end of the Cold War with the collapse of the Soviet Union, and the rapid expansion of technology leading to the dot-com bubble. The new millennium brought the Great Recession of 2008, the election of the first African-American president, Barack Obama, and increasing political polarization. This history culminated in the COVID-19 pandemic, the contentious 2020 election, and the unprecedented January 6th insurrection on the U.S. Capitol in 2021, which demonstrated the profound political divisions still challenging the nation today. Despite enduring continuous and often violent changes politically, socially, and economically since 1776, the history is a testament to the nation's indomitable spirit, resilience, and its ability to adapt and change.